Pay attention to the CCTV footage. It was Thursday, March 12, 2020, at precisely 8:03 p.m. The security camera caught an unsettling scene. In the middle of the frame, 32-year-old investigative journalist Eliza Ward can be seen leaving the building. She steps onto the cold concrete of the dimly lit parking lot, her brown leather bag slung over her shoulder. She doesn't seem in any hurry, just a quiet, unassuming presence, as she glances briefly over her shoulder, then moves toward her car, parked at the far end of the lot. The camera's vantage point is high, providing a clear view of the parking lot's expansive stretch. The dull glow from the overhead streetlights casts long shadows, but Eliza remains calm and unaffected, walking at a steady pace toward her vehicle. There is no one else visible, no movement in the parking lot except for a faint ripple of the wind. The entire scene feels almost too serene, a moment of mundane calm before a storm. The footage holds a peculiar detail, however. As Eliza approaches her car, the security camera catches a flicker of movement from the far corner of the frame, just a slight distortion. At first, it's almost imperceptible, but upon further inspection it's clear someone has followed her. This person, cloaked in shadow, steps from the cover of a nearby SUV and lingers at the edge of the lot. There is no clear face, no identity confirmation, only the movement, a figure slipping in and out of the camera's view. Then, as quickly as they appear, the figure retreats, vanishing into the darkness beyond. Eliza continues her path toward the car, unaware of the silent presence that has been tailing her since her departure from the building. She unlocks the door, climbs in, and begins to pull away, unaware that her every move has been tracked. The camera's last recorded frame shows the car's headlights flicker on, and the engine hums to life. A shadow in the distance, still unidentifiable, recedes into the far corner of the screen, just as the Subaru's taillights disappear from view. The footage is chilling in its simplicity. Eliza Ward, who had walked out of the building like any other night, was unknowingly followed by someone who knew exactly when and where she would be. The police, already investigating her disappearance, would find this footage to be one of the most damning pieces of evidence. But at that moment, the footage only raises more questions than it answers. Who was this person? Why were they following Eliza? And what happened between 8:03 p.m.? And the moment her car was found abandoned 3 hours later. The next morning, Nina Peterson, a close friend of Eliza's and a fellow journalist, was starting her day when she noticed that Eliza hadn't responded to any of her calls. The two had planned to meet for coffee, as they often did. It was unlike Eliza to miss their regular catch-up without at least sending a quick text. Concerned, Nina called the office. The receptionist confirmed that Eliza had been at work the previous night, finishing up some articles, but hadn't shown up this morning. By 10 a.m., Nina's worry turned into full-blown anxiety. She tried reaching Eliza again, but no answer. She called Eliza's mother, and when she also didn't hear anything, Nina drove to Eliza's apartment. No one was home. Her car wasn't parked in its usual spot, and the apartment complex was eerily quiet. The sense of unease that had been growing in Nina's chest now settled into something more concrete. Eliza was missing. Detective Carla Hughes was assigned to the case. Missing persons cases are never easy, especially when there's so little to go on. But the absence of Eliza Ward, someone so embedded in the local media scene, felt different. Hughes had worked many missing persons cases, but Eliza was not just a random name. She was a well-known investigative journalist, and that made her case more sensitive. The first step was reviewing the security footage. The moment the footage from the parking lot appeared on Hughes' screen, she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. The timestamp was clear. 8:03 p.m. Eliza Ward was leaving the building. It seemed mundane at first. She was leaving her office, walking to her car. But Hughes knew better than to let her guard down. It wasn't the simple act of leaving work that was suspicious. It was the figure that followed her into the parking lot, barely visible, only appearing briefly on the camera. Hughes felt a knot form in her stomach as she replayed the footage. The figure stepped out from the shadows of a nearby SUV, walking at a deliberate pace, as if they had been waiting for Eliza to leave. The detective zoomed in, but the figure was elusive, obscured by darkness. Still, it was the timing that made her uneasy. The figure had been waiting. They had been watching Eliza, and now they had followed her. The police quickly began investigating anyone who might have had access to Eliza's work, and anyone who had made threats against her, or had been following her. Hughes was particularly focused on Eliza's recent investigation into City Councilman John Hayes. Eliza had written several pieces exposing corruption involving public funds, and Hayes had been one of the most vocal critics of her reporting. It wasn't hard to suspect that Eliza's work might have brought her into dangerous territory, but finding a direct connection between Hayes and her disappearance would take time. Detective Hughes was methodical in her approach. She spoke to Eliza's colleagues and friends, trying to piece together what she had been working on in the days leading up to her disappearance. There was no indication that Eliza had been threatened directly, but everyone who knew her said the same thing. Eliza didn't back down from a story, no matter how dangerous it got. With the footage as the only real evidence, Hughes turned to the surrounding businesses, hoping to find more CCTV footage that might give them a better understanding of what had happened after Eliza left the building. Most of the businesses had already overwritten their tapes, but a few remained. One of the nearby hotels had captured something strange on its exterior camera: a dark van driving by at the same time Eliza was leaving. The van didn't stop, but it passed by at a slow, deliberate pace. Hughes knew it wasn't a coincidence. The van was too close to Eliza's location at the time of her disappearance to be unrelated. The detectives managed to trace the vehicle's license plate. It was registered to a man named Alan Whitaker, a former associate of John Hayes. Whitaker had a criminal record, including assault charges, which immediately made him a person of interest. But the real breakthrough came when Hughes learned that Whitaker had been involved in a previous abduction case, a fact that made him even more dangerous. Was Whitaker hired by Hayes to intimidate Eliza? Was there more to this case than just a simple disappearance? The investigation moved quickly, but Whitaker remained elusive. His alibi for the night of Eliza's disappearance didn't check out, and the detectives began to close in on him. Meanwhile, Nina's worries about her friend turned to grief. She couldn't shake the thought of Eliza being alone, unprotected. She knew Eliza, knew her strength, and her relentless pursuit of the truth. But she also knew her friend wasn't invincible. The fear of what might have happened began to weigh heavily on Nina's heart. 5 days later, the discovery of a body near the St. Lawrence River confirmed their worst fears. Workers had stumbled upon the body in a desolate area, miles away from Eliza's office. The forensic team identified the body as Eliza Ward. She had been bound, with bruises visible on her wrists and ankles. There were no signs of a struggle at the scene, but the lack of blood or other injuries raised more questions. The cause of death was ruled as asphyxiation, a grim confirmation that Eliza had been murdered. Detective Hughes immediately focused on the evidence that connected Whitaker to the crime. His van was found to contain traces of Eliza's blood, and DNA samples confirmed he had been in direct contact with her before her death. The trail was clear. Alan Whitaker had followed Eliza that night, attacked her, and driven her to a remote location where he ended her life. The case against Whitaker was ironclad. The video footage, DNA evidence, and forensic reports all pointed to him as Eliza's killer. He was arrested, and after a long interrogation he eventually confessed to his role in the murder. The motive was chillingly simple. He had been hired by John Hayes to intimidate Eliza and prevent her from exposing the truth. What started as an attempt to silence a journalist ended in cold-blooded murder. Claude Whitaker was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but for Nina, for Eliza's family, and for those who had known her, justice was a small comfort. Eliza's legacy, however, would not be forgotten. She had fought for truth, even when the cost was too high, and her story would live on as a reminder of the dangers faced by those who seek to expose corruption. In the days following the arrest of Claude Whitaker, Detective Carla Hughes found herself reflecting on the case that had consumed her for the past week. Though she had seen her fair share of violent crimes, there was something haunting about this one. The investigation had unraveled quickly, but it had also been emotionally taxing. Eliza Ward wasn't just another victim. She was a journalist who had dedicated her life to revealing the truth. The very act of uncovering the truth had cost her everything. Hughes walked into the precinct's conference room, where the final reports were being gathered. Whitaker's arrest had made headlines, but the questions lingering in the air felt more profound than any arrest could resolve. What drove Whitaker to kill Eliza? What role did John Hayes play in all of this? And why did it have to come to such a violent end? Whitaker's interrogation had taken a toll on the investigators. He had confessed quickly, though his demeanor had been oddly detached. It wasn't remorse that had caused him to confess. It was the inevitable nature of his situation. Whitaker had been hired by Hayes to intimidate Eliza, to silence her before she could expose the corruption that linked him to shady real estate deals. What started as a simple threat had turned into something far more sinister. As the interrogation video played on a screen, Hughes watched as Whitaker mumbled through his admission. His voice was vacant, as if he had already detached from the reality of his actions. "I didn't want to kill her. I just wanted to scare her," he had said in a monotone voice. "I was paid to follow her, to make her back off, but she didn't stop. She just kept digging. And then, when she fought back, I had to stop her." Whitaker's confession made it clear. He hadn't planned on murder, but in the heat of the moment when Eliza resisted and fought for control, he had panicked. His actions had escalated quickly, and before he knew it, Eliza was dead. The coldness of his words haunted the room. There was no regret in his voice, just the chilling matter-of-factness of a man who had been paid to do a job and, in the process, destroyed a life. As Detective Hughes processed the final details of the case, another part of her mind drifted back to Eliza's friends and family. Nina Peterson had been a constant presence, her grief palpable, but her resolve was even stronger. Eliza had been a woman who never hesitated to seek out uncomfortable truths, no matter the cost. Nina, like everyone else who knew Eliza, was left with the weight of her absence, but also with a burning desire to carry on Eliza's work. Hughes sat in her office, reading the final report. The timeline was clear. Whitaker had been following Eliza that night, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when she would leave the building. He had approached her car, and after a brief confrontation had overpowered her, forcing her into his vehicle. The investigation had found traces of her blood in his van, the marks of her resistance all over the interior. Eliza had fought for her life, but she hadn't stood a chance against a man like Whitaker. With the evidence now conclusive, the case moved forward to trial. The court hearings were emotionally draining for Eliza's family and friends. They had been forced to relive the harrowing details of Eliza's last moments, but through it all, they remained united in their determination to see justice served. Whitaker's defense attorneys had tried to argue that his actions had been the result of a momentary lapse in judgment, but the evidence was irrefutable. The jury took less than 3 hours to reach a verdict. Claude Whitaker was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed, but for those who had known Eliza, the conviction didn't bring relief. It didn't bring her back. It didn't erase the trauma or the unanswered questions. It only confirmed the terrible truth. Eliza Ward, the courageous journalist who had dedicated her life to uncovering the truth, had been silenced by those who wanted to keep their secrets hidden. A few weeks after the trial, Detective Hughes stood outside the courthouse, watching as Eliza's mother, her friends, and colleagues gathered for a memorial service in her honor. It was a quiet affair, a somber acknowledgement of a life taken too soon. The media had moved on to the next big story, but for Nina and those who had loved Eliza, the pain of her loss was still fresh. Nina stood at the front of the crowd, her eyes red from crying, but her posture straight and proud. She had made a promise to herself, to Eliza, that she would continue the work her friend had started. Eliza's stories weren't just pieces of writing, they were beacons of truth, shining a light on the darkness that others wanted to keep hidden. Nina had made the decision to finish Eliza's unfinished stories, to make sure that her friend's voice would never fade. "Thank you, everyone, for being here," Nina said quietly, looking out at the group. "Eliza would have wanted us to keep going. She wouldn't want us to stop now, to let the fear of what happened stop us from fighting for the truth. We owe it to her, and we owe it to ourselves." As the memorial service concluded, Detective Hughes remained at the back of the crowd, watching from afar. She had done her job, the case had been solved. But the weight of Eliza's murder would stay with her for a long time. She had seen too many cases like this, Too many people who thought they could silence others with violence. But something about Eliza's case had been different. She had been a journalist, a truth-teller, someone who believed that the story was always worth pursuing, no matter the cost. And in the end, it had been that very pursuit of truth that had cost her everything. As Detective Hughes walked away from the courthouse, the cold wind biting at her skin, she reflected on the case. Justice had been served, but at what cost? The world had lost a courageous journalist, and though her killer had been brought to justice, the emptiness remained. Eliza Ward had been taken too soon, but her legacy lived on. In the end, all that remained was a chilling thought. Sometimes, in the pursuit of truth, the price is far greater than anyone could have imagined.